Hello and welcome to Willis Resilience TV and this, our first edition of Willis Expedition News. For the next month, we'll be following the remarkable story of teenager Parker Liato as he attempts to set world records trekking across the most inhospitable place on Earth. We'll also be conducting daily debates on environmental issues with panels of various experts and public figures, debates that might get a little spiky. And all of this will be happening live from the Willis building in London. So we'll be monitoring Parker every step, trip, slip, slide and stumble of the way as he tries to make the journey from the coast to the South Pole in just 22 days. And if he succeeds, he'll become the youngest man ever to ski to both poles. Today we'll bring you the first update on where Parker and the team are as they prepare for the initial part of the expedition, the science leg. They'll be carrying out groundbreaking experiments in an effort to contribute to the cutting edge of climate change science, which will include collecting snow samples across the wonderfully titled Trans-Antarctic Mountain Range on a route that covers 640 kilometres of unstudied territory. And that is the link that leads to our studio discussions. For instance, later in this show, we'll compare the West's response to climate change with that of developing nations and examine how the big economies of the future are balancing growth with reducing emissions. So that debate to come later, plus we'll set up our first topic of discussion and learn more about our intrepid explorer Parker, who first made headlines when he attempted to reach the North Pole 4 years ago.
When I was 15, I attempted to walk to the North Pole. It was my first serious polar expedition. And Doug turned around. He said, "We're not going to make it." It completely changed my perspective on success and failure and hard work and humility and reality, you know?
So welcome to our purpose-built studio in a corner of the foyer at the Willis building, which is in the heart of the City of London. This set was actually built across town and transported here to the Willis building last weekend when construction started. They worked through the week, working overnight on weekdays so as not to disrupt operations at Willis. And this is what some very talented people came up with. A state-of-the-art, high-definition studio, and I am reliably informed that it is soundproof, so I can shout if I want, but most of the time I won't. The team here have already shown great resilience, which I'm sure Willis will be very proud of. So politicians, policy makers, scientists, all with differing views and all welcome in this studio to discuss one of the burning issues of our age, climate change. And thankfully, it's a lot warmer in the studio than I'm sure it is in Antarctica. So I found my home, but where is Parker? We're hoping to speak to the man himself live via satellite every day, including today. But first, let's show you where he should be now. At the bottom of this line being drawn across Antarctica is the start point for the record attempt, which was supposed to begin today. And just note that when that does start, he'll be pulling his own body weight of kit and supplies on a sled for nearly 400 miles. But best laid plans and all that, as you see from this map, they're not quite on schedule now. The weather has already thrown up challenges. The team were unable to land their plane in the Antarctic and were stuck on the southern tip of Latin America. But happily, they are on ice and the science leg of the expedition is well underway. But they weren't slacking at all during the delay. Our film crew sent back this report on how they handled the downtime.
Everything's been going pretty good. We're just working really hard and trying to get the final preparations done. There's always issues with packing everything into the truck. I think it's going to require some creativity. So you pee in one of these, but It also acts doubly as a sleeping bag warmer, effectively. Trust me, when it's minus 50 degrees, it's one of the most pleasant things that there can actually be.
We've been scrambling for about 3 days now, trying to get everything ready, and we've made some progress. The weather is a little bit iffy right now as we're hopefully flying in on the 23rd, which is 2 days from now. Hopefully AO will let me drive because this thing's bad.
We're finally all packed up. We've done the final weight and it came in at just under 5 tons. I think that was slightly more than AO, the driver, wanted. He spent a long time picking through all my camera kit and my pelly cases, trying to make me throw kit out. But in the end, I managed to get it all on board.
So the Willis Resilience Expedition team is here in Punta Arenas, one of the most southern towns in the world. Rumor has it that if you kiss the toe of the statue of the Indian on this big statue of Magellan, it will ensure your safe return from your journey. So we're gonna kiss the toe and see what happens.
Our departure date was yesterday, and we're delayed today, and we're looking at weather every 12 hours. The extended weather forecast doesn't look super promising in the next 48 hours, but we're looking at it every 12 hours to hopefully get a weather window.
Nathan and I are labeling bottles that will be used for sampling water in Antarctica. It will be analyzed for their tritium content at the most accurate tritium lab in the world at the Institute of Geological and Nuclear Science in New Zealand. So we've just been sort of sitting around Punta Arenas now for 8 days or so. So we're now to the 3rd day of delay, and we're just trying to figure out ways to try to pass the time before we can catch our flight to Antarctica. And so the whole team is going to go and see some penguins, see what we can learn from them before heading south. So we came here to see. I think we have a lot in common right now. Just kind of wandering around, not doing a whole lot. Waiting for something to happen to us.
Thankfully, not long after that, they were able to take off from Chile and they landed safely on Antarctica, and they are now well and truly underway on the science leg of the expedition. It's time to welcome our first guest here on Willis Resilience TV, and it's a man that I'm sure plenty of Willis employees will recognise, Rowan Douglas, who is chair of the Willis Research Network. Morning to you, Rowan.
Dan, good morning.
First question, this is the building that you come to work in every morning, is it?
It is.
What's it like coming in and seeing a studio in the corner of the foyer?
Well, it's made us insurance brokers feel pretty glamorous, actually, seeing this studio being built every day. But I feel very privileged, Dan, because I think I must be, apart from the comms team, the very first person who's seen behind the screen. And all I can say is to my colleagues, it's well worth it. Get yourself an invite in here.
But it's not as glamorous, is it, Rowan?
It's very glamorous on this half. That half isn't quite so glamorous, but
come and see both sides. Yeah,
but a lot of people doing a lot of hard work. Yeah, you know, there's really a lot of sweat equity going in behind the scenes.
Generally speaking, it's the uglier people, which is kind of why we keep them over in those dark,
yeah, this is you know, you've obviously broken the rules here, but anyway.
Yeah, no, not at all. That would apply for me as well. It's really great to be here, and a very special thing that's happening down on the South Pole. Let's talk about that delay, though, and how frustrating that would have been for the likes of Parker and the team.
Well, it just goes to show that this isn't stage managed. Yeah. I think it's important for us all to realise really how real and tough this is. This isn't this isn't just an ordinary trip that most of us make. They were delayed for 7 days. It must have been absolutely infuriating that the weather was so bad. And I know they had other challenges as well. But they finally, I think, early on Friday morning our time, managed to make it across in their Russian aircraft to Union Glacier and begin their journey.
And right from the off, it shows that they can be at the mercy of the elements.
Absolutely. It is truly extreme out there, and they deserve our thoughts and prayers or whatever. I mean, it's tough.
But again, on a plus side, it did give them extra time to go through the equipment and that wonderful icebreaker truck that they've got.
I think that's a great name, I have to say,
Yeah.
the icebreaker. Yeah, it has, and I know on the science side, it gave them some important time to deal with some challenges they had there.
Yeah.
As with all battles, the plan is the first casualty, and they had some challenges there. But I have to say, I met Parker in August. He's a remarkable young guy, and one of the key things his is the ability to be flexible and to change when problems turn. He's truly adaptable. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's about time we found out a little bit more about them. And what were you doing at 19? Can you remember?
I can't, probably too alcoholic haze, but
Well,
not what he's doing, I can assure
Not
you.
dissimilar to me. When I was 19, I was pretending to study and drinking far too much cheap lager. At the same age, Parker Liautaud is trekking to the South Pole in the name of science. It's time to find out what makes him tick.
When I was 15, I attempted to walk to the North Pole. It was my first serious polar expedition. And then we got to within 15 miles of the pole, and there was this thing, this 9-mile long open water section cutting us off from the North Pole east to west. It was a couple hundred meters across. And there was this moment when Doug turned around. He said, "We're not going to make it." And I just, my heart just sank. I felt awful in November, December 2010 because no one wanted to sponsor my second attempt. That was at the very end, where I was so close to the point where it just wasn't going to happen because it was too late, and I was really not believing in myself. I couldn't sleep at night. I was borderline depressed, and I just couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle the idea of being the guy who tried once, failed, and never did it again. It was just an awful feeling. I felt like that was my destiny. It was going to be that, and I couldn't deal with it.
I received an email, unsolicited email from Parker. He got me in the first paragraph as he introduced himself as, at that time, an 18-year-old teenager who had experience of going to the North Pole, had a desire to get funding in terms of achieving a world record attempt in Antarctica. The science, etc., all came across in that very first paragraph, and I must say I was hooked.
You know, when I did that first attempt, I couldn't see it at the time because I felt like it was the worst moment of my life, but it was actually the best moment of my life. It redefined the way that I thought about everything in life. It redefined how I viewed myself in the context of all of these things. It completely changed my perspective on success and failure and hard work and humility and reality, you know?
Well, Willis is supporting this expedition because we, like Parker, are curious about what exists beyond our imagination. And so Parker has never walked to the South Pole, and we wanted to take that walk with him.
I've spent a lot of time with Parker, spent some time with him training with some clients. I've been to a lot of events with him. He's a really inspirational young man, quite remarkable 19-year-old by any standard.
When I first was due to meet him, I imagined this was, yes, a very bold and adventurous, principled young man, and that's enough. We are working with a truly impressive young scientist.
The science on this expedition is composed of 3 programs, and they're not programs that I came up with on my own that I'm going to go do the sampling and then we'll study them myself and be the lead on this. I worked with a number of scientists from around the world to compose this program that will potentially create the most value that we can out of this expedition.
The Antarctic is like the canary in the cage. If you like, small changes in climate in the mid-latitudes are very significant changes in the high latitudes, and so the Antarctic is a great place to understand what's going on. What Parker's going to be doing is understanding change in the Antarctic over the last 50 years or so.
There are always new risks. There are always new means by which we can become more resilient. And so Parker Leotard, all of 19 years old, represents this in a metaphor, which is, how can I, if I'm Parker, make this expedition, understand what's happening to our polar ice caps, do science along the way, feed that imagination, feed that understanding when he gets back, and hopefully make our humankind more resilient for decades to come.
Obviously, we all at Willis hope that Parker will be successful in terms of his endeavour. However, we recognise that that's not given. That obviously there is challenge and risk in the endeavour itself. We're in the risk business. Our clients are in the risk business. And I think very much what Willis have brought to Parker's expedition is an understanding of risk mitigation, planning for risk, and trying to make every attempt that lies behind the expedition to be achievable.
I looked to the polar regions as a mechanism for delivering concrete results, which is, how do we engage people, how do we inform people, how do we bring these issues closer to them, how do we reignite the dialogue, how can we fundamentally change the way that we talk about climate science.
The theme of resilience is becoming a theme that allows us to communicate what we do. And Parker's journey, both a scientific journey of understanding global resilience, but also the personal resilience of a human representing mankind in an extreme environment, frankly, spoke to another part of our soul as a company. And to meet Parker is to discover a very special young man. So to be part of his journey, I think, has inspired us all.
Antarctica is an unpredictable, dangerous, exciting, wild place. I don't know if I'm going to be okay on day 15 or day 19, or if there is even going to be a day 15 or day 19. I just have no idea. There's no way to know.
Certainly is a remarkable young man, isn't he? Just to let you know that we have, Rowan and I, been joined in the studio by our panel of guests, who we will introduce to you formally very shortly. But fingers crossed, we can cross live and speak to Parker, who is somewhere heading towards the South Pole. This is the first time we've attempted it. The satellite connection is up. So hopefully, Parker, can you hear me? There's going to be a fairly long delay, of course, because of satellite. But Parker, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you.
Fantastic. We have words. Now, when we get vision, there will be a huge cheer that we might be able to hear all the way from London directly. So Parker, tell us, whereabouts are you right now?
We are about halfway between the coast of Antarctica and the South Pole. We're at the Thiel Mountains.
And how are you all feeling?
We're all feeling great. It's been a really great journey so far. I think we're all just really just getting started and really excited for the journey ahead.
Yeah, that delay that you had in Chile must have been somewhat frustrating for you.
It was a bit of a day after day of delay. I think it's kind of typical of Antarctica, though. It's just sort of what happens. You know, we really have to wait for a weather window. You can't land here unless it's totally clear. And the fog came in and white out only about 10 minutes after we landed. So it was a close one.
So because you're a little bit behind schedule, have you had to try and make time up?
Yeah, we don't even sort of know what time it is here anymore. We pulled a 24-hour day yesterday, and we went to sleep in the morning, got up in the early afternoon, but very little sleep. I think we put up the tent twice so far.
Yeah.
and we're really just hurtling towards the South Pole, but still trying to do the science in the way that we planned. And so we've just finished our 4th ice core, and we'll be doing our 5th pretty soon.
Parker, we have pictures of you, and to prove that that is actually you in Antarctica, can you just give us a quick wave and maybe do some Gangnam Style or something?
I don't know about that, but I can wave.
This is fantastic. I mean, this is genuinely exciting, I think, that we do have the ability to speak to you live on this journey. Rowan Douglas is with us in the studio. Rowan, I don't know if you've got a question that you want to ask Parker about what's happened so far.
Parker, it's just absolutely wonderful to see you there. Our family were thinking of you this weekend, where you were going. I can tell my 5-year-old daughter that I have actually seen you. She was quite concerned. But also, I want to congratulate you, because I know in the last week you've had to do a lot of improvisation with some challenges that befell you and the team, and it just proves that we've put our money on a very good man, because you've been able to improvise brilliantly in terms of your preparation. So congratulations from all of us. We're very proud of what you're doing.
Well, it's one of the coincidental benefits of the delay that we had. So,
Parker, got to ask you this question. It's a balmy 10 degrees centigrade at the moment here in London. What's it like there?
It's probably around minus 30 degrees Celsius here, and very little wind. It's clear skies, very sunny, very nice day.
It looks beautiful. I know you haven't had experience of the South Pole before. This might be a really stupid question, but is it any different to the North Pole?
Yeah, the South Pole is very high. It's on a continent, and the North Pole is in an ocean surrounded by continents, or surrounded by land.
And what about the rest of the team, Parker? We should name check them, shouldn't we? You've got Paddy, who's the cameraman. I'm assuming he's behind the shots that we're seeing now. Doug Stoop, who's the polar guide. Driver Ao, and Nathan Hanbrook Skinner, who'll be familiar to Willis employees, of course, as well. What are they up to now?
We're just all sort of doing our own roles. Paddy, continuing the, Paddy's our cameraman. He is doing the filming and editing, and Nathan is continuing with the communications, and Doug is up front doing guiding with the crevasses a bit and making sure that we're not going into any dangerous territory. And Ao is the one pulling the 24-hour days to get us here, get us towards the South Pole and then out towards the Limerick Glacier as fast as possible.
Is it that? I know it's 24-hour daylight, isn't it, at the moment, because it's essentially summertime down there. Is it that bright as we can see? 24 hours?
Yeah, it's sunlight.
And so how does that affect you guys? How do you manage your sleep patterns?
It's just a lot about sleeping when we can at this stage. It's different because we're not doing regular days, but we're also, when we do get into the tent, we manage to get some sleep. It's pretty easy because we're doing long days and we're all pretty tired. But as a teenager, I tend to just be able to sleep anyway. But the rest of the team sometimes uses eye shades or earplugs and things like that. So it's just really a matter of resting when we can, really.
Yeah, I think most 19-year-olds at the moment are still pretty much asleep at this time in the morning, and maybe up until 11 o'clock. Yeah, it's quite a remarkable thing that you're doing at such a young age. And just the final question, I know you're knackered and you want to go and rest, but just give us an update on the science and the importance of that to what this expedition is.
Well, this is really what we're doing. There's no other reason why we're standing here in the middle of Antarctica right now. This is why we're doing our crossing from the coast to the pole to the coast before the speed record, and it's been logistically challenging, but actually very rewarding. And we've been able to do everything pretty much on track with what we had planned. So far, we have done 4 cores. What we're looking at in the ice is these samples. We're measuring the concentration of tritium, which is a radioactive form of hydrogen, and it tells us about how the water cycle works in Antarctica, and we're trying to figure out what the differences are in how much there is of this form of hydrogen around Antarctica, and it does actually tell us a great deal about how we can better understand climate change. And so what we're going to be doing is taking 10 cores and snow pits throughout Antarctica, looking at samples from the various annual layers that we can just get through depths in Antarctica in the snow, and we'll be sending those down to New Zealand for analysis. So we're about halfway through that right now, and I'm excited to continue and to really make sure that we do it right, and I'm really happy with the way it's gone so far.
And is there a one-sentence mission statement that you guys have?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you have a mission statement to summarize?
Yeah, I mean, there's really two things that this expedition is about. It's about contributing to better understanding our changing world, and it's about reinvigorating the importance of the dialogue on climate change that will eventually lead to solid policy. And I think, in particular, this whole thing is it's all about resilience. That's why the expedition is called the Willis Resilience Expedition. We've had our challenges already before we even set foot on the ice. When I landed in Punta Arenas, our entire scientific program could have been wiped out. But we had planned in such a way that made our expedition resilient enough to get back on its feet and get everything sorted again. Then we faced a number of challenges so far just in the truck. For instance, our heating unit broke, our power in the truck broke, and we have found ways to fix those as well. And it's going to continue to be like this throughout our journey. That's just the way it is, and it's going to be like this throughout the unsupported journey as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's an important lesson for how we address global issues like climate change, because there's never going to be an easy way to do it, but it just really has to be done.
Yeah, rather you than me, to be honest, on that front, but it is a much-needed work. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us. I'm so happy this has worked, because we do look forward to keeping bang up to date with your progress. Thanks, Parker. Sleep well.
Thank you so much, Dan.
You noticed we maintained audio, but lost satellite feed as far as the vision is concerned. That's an indication of how things might be as we go forward over the next 3-4 weeks. But we will do our best to see and hear from Parker and the team throughout the expedition. It's wonderful, isn't it? I know as a Willis man yourself, it's going to be extra nice, isn't it, to see that this is all coming together and we're able to actually see this happen.
It is quite remarkable, and fabulous. But great to be here. Great to be here with our guests as well.
Again, it's about time we brought you guys in, but we're waiting very patiently and couldn't actually hear Parker, so a little bit confused as to what that conversation was all about. So the Antarctic is incredibly difficult to explore. It's hugely important to do so, as Parker was saying. It acts as a sensitive barometer for environmental change and might help us understand extreme weather events, such as last year's Hurricane Sandy that tore through the Caribbean and the east coast of the United States, leaving parts of New York City underwater. And it's hard to forget these pictures. Just a month ago, Typhoon Haiyan caused devastation in the Philippines. Over 5,000 killed and millions displaced. Aid efforts are, of course, still ongoing. So is our weather getting more extreme? Are events like Haiyan and Sandy linked to climate change? And if so, what can we do to become more resilient to the threat the weather poses to our lives, homes, and the very fabric of our communities? So in the studio to discuss the issue of extreme weather, we have finally Tony Grayling, Head of Climate and Community at the UK Government's Environment Agency. Nice to see you, Tony. Mark Maslin, Professor of Climatology at University College London. Rowan Douglas, of course, who we've already met this morning, who is chair of Willis Research Network, and getting the short straw on my left-hand side here, Benny Pizer of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Morning to you, gentlemen. Thanks very much indeed for being so patient as we chatted to a man in the middle of Antarctica there, which I'm still kind of getting over. And a very tricky discussion to kick off with, and this may be the trickiest question of all. Mark, I'll start with you, and the simple question is is our weather getting more extreme?
We are seeing lots of changes in our weather. I'll give you an example from the UK. On average, last year we had about the right amount of rain. However, we had the driest first 6 months ever recorded in UK meteorological history, and then we had the wettest. And so what we're finding is actually the shifts in climate and weather are actually occurring, and they're changing what we expect to be normal weather.
Is that what you've found as well at the Environment Agency, Tony? Have you got the same kind of data that Mark's referring to?
Absolutely, it's quite right. In 2012, we saw 1 in 5 days suffered flooding, but 1 in 4 days we had drought, with more than 20 million people suffering from hosepipe bans, for example. And this could be indicative of what we will see in the future. The projections for the UK suggest that we're going to have more rain in the winter, less in the summer, more droughts therefore, but also more flooding with more rainfall in intense downfalls.
What about internationally? Was Haiyan, for you, evidence that weather is getting more extreme?
It's always very difficult to attribute a particular event to underlying climate change. I think what you can say is the sort of things you might expect to see more of in the future. And in the case of the UK, it's definitely more drought, more flooding, more heat waves. I think the jury is out as to whether you could attribute particular hurricanes to climate change.
Benny, let's come to you. The same question I put to Mark. Do you think our weather, globally, weather is becoming more extreme?
Well, in order to answer that question, we have to look at a long period to see whether weather extremes are on the rise. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change looked at the last 100 years. That's a pretty long period, and came to the conclusion that most of the extreme weather events like droughts and flooding and tropical storms have not increased. There's no statistically relevant trend, upward trend. So let's put this back. If we had the same debate 100 years ago, and you would ask us 100 years ago, you know, we will have global warming in 100 years. Will extreme weather events go up? And people were saying, we had, you know, a 1 degree warming over 100 years, and extreme weather events haven't increased. So there's not a total correlation.
We'll talk more about the link to climate change and global warming, but Rowan, Benny made the point there that empirical measurements are still relatively new, aren't they, when we're talking about measuring extreme weather conditions. Is that a problem when it comes to that simple question of, are they getting worse?
Partly. There's a number of ways you can look at it, though. We have to enable insurance and reinsurance companies to become resilient to extremes, and so we and our reinsurance partners in RAL don't really have an ideological point of view. We just have to look at the physics and the economics. And there's one very interesting pattern. If we look at the last 40 years, since 1970, since really the industry's been collecting loss details consistently, we see a sharp rise in the losses from hydrometeorological events. And you say, well, that could be to do with incidence and severity, but it also could be to do with the growth of exposure, i.e. the level of insured buildings and all the rest of it. But I think that the statistic that shocks most of us is when we look at the seismic risk, the level of, if we look at losses over the last 40 years and we index everything to current money, the losses are pretty constant. We look at the hydromet risk and the losses just grow constantly and in an accelerating fashion. Obviously, they vary year by year because that's the nature of extreme events, but why is it that the seismic-related hazards are constant over 40 years? The hydrometeorological ones are changing. This is an interesting observation which we need to get our heads around.
Well, let's kick that on then, Mark. What's your
Well, I have to slightly disagree with Benny's interpretation of the IPCC. There is clear evidence that actually hydrological changes have occurred. So, for example, when you look at the Northern Hemisphere over the last 60 years, there's statistical evidence that the number of heavy, intense rainstorms has actually increased. And this is the thing we're seeing. We're actually seeing more intense, more focused thunderstorms, winter storms, and that's actually what's causing a lot of these problems. And so when we focus on, say, an individual hurricane, it's very difficult to actually say whether that hurricane is or isn't linked to climate change. Because again, actually about hurricanes, it's actually where it hits which causes the damage, not how many there are. And so you have to be very careful with those. But if you then take this broad spectrum, we know that rainfall events, heavy rainfall events across the northern hemisphere have intensified over the last 60 to 70 years.
And Benny, I'll let you come back on this point, but I just want to just mention this. This is from an article in the Guardian a couple of months ago, saying that scientists from the UK Met Office and their counterparts in the US detected the fingerprints of climate change on about half of the 12 most extreme weather events of 2012, which you sort of might back up some of the claims here.
Well, let's put it this way. This whole area is highly contentious. All I was pointing out was if you look at a long period of time, if you look at the last 100 years, there's no clear signal that there is a measurable increase in some of the worst. I mean, rainfall, heat waves, yes, there is some evidence that this has gone up. But the flooding, the tropical storms, the droughts, the IPCC is quite adamant there is no significant increase. That doesn't mean it won't happen in the future, but for the time being, we cannot make claims that go against observational, empirical facts.
Tony, is everybody looking at the same data, the same research, the same figures here? Because as a layman here, I do find it remarkable
well, of course, I mean,
that some really erudite scientists are disagreeing.
Global warming is unequivocal. It's extremely likely that the main cause of that, particularly over the last half century or so, is emissions of greenhouse gases from human activities. Benny is right, there is a lot of natural climate variation against which you have to detect the underlying effect of climate change. But I think we would be complacent if we did not now take action to make ourselves more resilient in the future and take action to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions so that we can actually limit the amount of climate change that we will see in the future.
Believing as you do of the link, what needs to be done in the future?
I think the key thing is that we need to accept that CO2 and the other greenhouse gases are pollutants that we have to deal with. Just like we've dealt with, say, the ozone crisis and CFCs, we need to actually say, fine, we've actually got a fantastic society, it's unfortunately carbon-based, we now actually need to say, fine, but we didn't realise it had consequences that we couldn't see. So we need to actually just change our society. It doesn't mean actually becoming poorer or actually suffering in any shape or form, but we have to just change our economy, nudge it in the way that we remove our reliance on fossil fuels.
You agree with that, Benny?
Well, this is a completely different issue to extreme weather events, because the question is how do we deal with the extremes? Because let's be clear, whatever we do about the CO2, these storms will continue, so these tropical storms will continue, and flooding will continue, and droughts will continue, regardless whether there's an international agreement or not, and regardless of whether we cut CO2. So the real question is not what are we doing about CO2, but what are we doing with the extreme weather events that will continue to hit communities and the insurance industry.
Well, this is where Willis and the whole idea of resilience comes in. For example, Bangladesh. Bangladesh suffers from massive cyclones. In the 1970s, they lost 300,000 people to cyclones. In the last 10 years, they've lost 3,000 because of good governance. They've changed the way they actually warn people. They have networks of bicycles to send out to the villages. So again, Willis have picked on the right thing. It's about resilience. It's about how do you help people to actually help themselves, to protect themselves against these extreme events.
That's a good point.
Yeah, and I guess probably everyone on the panel would agree with that, Ronan, and that's at the core of what you guys do.
It is, but I want, if I can, to try and square the circle between our guests, because it is about resilience, absolutely, and countries, states, countries, indeed families will have to think very carefully about their resilience to weather and climate in the future, and it's critical. Extreme events they will get worse for a variety of reasons. Changing levels of carbon in the atmosphere is one of them. It's a driving reason. But actually, resilience is ultimately about adaptation. And I think we would be complacent. I'd be complacent in this studio if I didn't say that looking ahead to 2050 and beyond, the lifetime of my children, we are looking at the prospect of a very different world. And no matter, unfortunately, what energy policies we put in place, even the most rigorous ones around reducing carbon, it seems that we will be likely burning up to 50% more fossil fuels in 2050 than we are now. And this is a challenge for all of us on both sides of this debate, because our world will be very different. And I think we will no longer be talking about green strategies. This will be talking about really acute strategies for the resilience of societies.
As a British citizen, I'm hoping that the Environment Agency aren't going to be complacent at all going forward. So what is being done? For instance, could London, we'll take the capital, and that's where we are right now in the City of London, could we be resilient to any type of weather condition here? If not, then what can be done about it?
Well, London is quite well protected because of the London Barrier and because of the flood defences in the Thames estuary. And we've undertaken a project looking ahead for the next century at what will need to be done to continue to protect London, and that looks perfectly feasible. In general terms, we are likely to have to invest more in flood defences over the next period.
How can you predict what might happen in 50 to 100 years? When I regularly see weather presenters on the telly unable to predict what's happening tomorrow.
Well, the only way you can do it is to create models and project forward, and those models have to be tested against historic weather, and that is a very good way of doing it. And then you have to make judgments on a risk basis as to what you're prepared to do as a society to invest in flood defences and different ways of managing water resources. Because one of the other things that our modelling shows in partnership with the Met Office is that by the middle of this century you might see late summer river flows 80% less in some cases than they are now. And that's going to have quite profound effects on agriculture and on the amount of water available for people and industry. And that means we're going to have to manage our water resources differently.
What's the feeling here? Are we going to make changes? Irrespective of, on a global scale.
Let's be realistic. We just had a UN climate summit in Warsaw in Poland, which ended like all other climate summits, undecided, deadlocked. There is no international agreement, and it is unlikely that there will a legally binding international agreement. So one has to be realistic of what is politically and internationally viable, and one has to take seriously the extreme weather events. Because the point is, I think Britain is doing exactly the right thing, preparing for things that are going to happen. Perhaps a little more, perhaps a little less, we don't know exactly. But to prepare for flooding, to prepare for droughts, is exactly what you have to do. And every country faces different challenges. Every country needs to adopt different policies to prepare for these things. Because let's face it, I don't know whether there will be an international agreement, and even if there is an international agreement, whether we will be able to reduce CO2 in the long term. No one knows. But what we do know is all societies face these challenges that they have to address now.
And Mark, last word to you on this. I know you're keen to stress mitigate and adapt.
Oh, absolutely. And I have to say I'm slightly more optimistic than Benny. Having been at the meeting in Warsaw, yes, it is a very difficult negotiation. You've got 186 countries trying to actually work it out. But what's interesting is you've got 186 countries that see climate change as a major issue. You have the big players, China, America, Europe, all actually talking about how they can best actually deal with it within their own economic framework. And so for me, moving forward over the next 2 years for that agreement in Paris in 2015, I actually think there's a lot of movement and there's a lot of understanding about the risks and the need not only to reduce carbon, which is the mitigation, but also to help different countries, particularly the developing countries, to protect their people and adapt to these extreme events.
We'll have to leave you there for this particular debate. Mark, Benny, I know you're going to stick around for the second debate. For now, Tony, thanks so much indeed. Rowan as well, thank you. So let's move it on to the second debate then. Climate change is a global problem and needs international cooperation to confront. But each nation's response to the risks faced and the resulting need to reduce emissions is different. We sent our reporter Nikki Shields to find out whether some nations are greener than others.
More than 2 in 5 of us live in what are called the emerging nations, whose economies are growing at an astonishing 3% a year faster than the world average. This economically mobile group includes India, Brazil, Russia, South Africa and China, with the biggest population and most exports on the planet. It's on track to overtake the US as the world's largest economy in the next decade. Because of this incredible industrialization, China is the world's worst polluter, recently taking that odious title from the States.
China's emissions increased by 3% in 2012. However, compared to recent history, this is negligible. Over the past decade, increases in emissions have rose by over 10% year on year. And over the last 8 years, between 2002 and 2010, they have more than doubled. This reduction owes a lot to China's new emphasis on renewable energy. China increased its use of hydroelectric power by 23% last year alone, mainly thanks to the Three Gorges Dam project. Whereas we're not doing so well here in the West, we've actually increased our reliance on fossil fuels. In the UK, we burnt 24% more coal last year.
To find out more, I've come to SOAS to talk to an expert on China, Harold Heubaum.
So Harold, tell me, is China actually starting to clean up its act?
The good news is that the use of renewables within China has grown extensively in the last few years. And that's hydro, that's wind, that's solar. And that's really good for a transition away from fossil fuels towards more emissions-friendly technologies and reducing carbon footprints. The place where there is policy certainty and policy stability going into the next 5-10 years might be China, because it's a different system to Western countries where governments change more often, where policy direction will change more often.
So it would seem that China may be able to actually build its way out of the environmental crisis. But are we able to do the same here in the UK?
What we need to do is get really serious about investing in renewable energy, wind, solar, and eventually tidal. And if you look around the world, you look at the US, China, Germany, they're powering ahead in those industries and we're being horribly left behind. The Green Party was always opposed to the Severn Barrage because it was a giant mammoth-scale project. What we've very much been in favour of is a much smaller lagoon-type system, much less impact on the environment, not that much difference in terms of the power that could potentially be generated.
So even the Green Party aren't that keen on doing something that could generate 5% of our energy needs. So what is it that we can do?
I wouldn't criticise people for pushing a green agenda. It makes a lot of sense. The only thing is, if you push a green agenda at the expense of tackling climate change, then I think you're missing a more immediate problem. You know, to say we want to move to a post-industrial society, fine. It's taken us a few hundred years to get here. It'll probably take us a few hundred years to get beyond the post-industrial society. If we don't start cutting emissions pretty drastically, we've probably got another 500 billion tonnes of carbon equivalent to go in the atmosphere, then all of those issues will go off the board. We'll be worried about actually surviving.
In many ways, the West is in a much more comfortable position, having gone through all these dirty phases of development and now switching to cleaner development, where we see that in terms of carbon emissions, they're either leveling off or they're dropping. China isn't quite there yet, but increasingly it is getting into a position where it can take steps that would resemble Western development.
We've heard from our experts. Let's find out what the people of Chinatown think.
In the West, we have more, knowledge, and also we are more developed, whereas China is still developing, so there might be a lack of expertise or knowledge.
I think China is actually progressing in terms of like being greener, because obviously you can see a lot of different places have adopted a different going green policy.
I think money is the top priority in China rather than environment or the green issue.
It might not be like the top priority, but at least it's good to see something actually progressing, whether fast or slow. But because you see, to implement a project like that might actually take a very long time, and you might not see the actual effect so soon.
What about the government in China? Do you think it really supports?
Yeah, I think the current government is really pushing lots of like environment policy and also really pay attention on this area. So I think there will be a huge policy to improve the environment.
Well, if you're just tuning in to Willis Resilience TV, we actually spoke to Parker Liato, who is trekking to the South Pole. They are on the ice and they are undertaking groundbreaking experiments on the science leg of the expedition. It was fantastic to speak to him, and I'm sure if you missed it, then you'll have a chance to watch it again via the website, willisresilience.com. Let's talk more about what issues are brought up in that VT. China was the example there, but a number of emerging nations are in the spotlight when it comes to balancing growth with reducing carbon emissions, and more developed nations face responsibility to invest in reducing their emissions, having polluted for over 100 years during their own industrial revolution. So to discuss the question of whether some nations are greener than others, and indeed whether some of us should be greener, we have a new panel of experts, including Ilmi Granhoff, environmental finance lawyer, Mark Maslin back with us, Professor of Climatology at University College London, Gareth Taylor is Professor of Power Systems at Brunel University, and Benny Peisel's also stayed with us. Benny's from the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Welcome to you all once again. Ilmi, let's start with you. When it comes to rankings, and I know you're in a position to be able to offer some more expert opinion on this, when it comes to rankings, who are the greenest nations and what are those rankings based on?
Well, I used to work on when I was in graduate school at Yale University, I worked on an environmental performance index, which was put on by Yale and the World Economic Forum and a research center at Columbia University. And it's pretty interesting to see. There's a couple different ways to answer the question. You can look at countries like Iceland, who do really, really well, but partly because they're endowed with things like massive geothermal reserves that can sort of push them along, or countries with existing forests that increase their biodiversity. But then there are also the countries, and these are the places where I think we really should focus, countries that don't necessarily have particular endowments, but are really aggressive on policy in transforming their economies to be more environmental. Switzerland was at the top of the list in 2012 and is a really good example because they've been very aggressive on pollution control, including the big pollution question, which is CO2, and have demonstrated that you can create policy change and really be progressive on this. Germany is another example. It's getting a bit of jitters right now in the energy space, but it has really demonstrated that you can have economic growth and productivity and really be policy forward-looking on this. The Scandinavians also do well in this regard.
Benny, do you think it's important for nations to be further up green rankings, whether they're fully developed or emerging?
Well, what we just heard is a classic example where we are. The wealthiest countries obviously have the wealth and the luxury to look after the environment properly. It's the poor countries that have other priorities. So if you look at the ranking, you will see that the most developed countries rank very high and the least developed countries very often very low. So economic development is actually very good for the environment because it means that there are people concerned about the environment and you have the economic background to actually do something about it.
Gareth, you've got plenty of ties to China and have done for a number of years. Is it the fact that they've got pots of cash? We've been hearing that they're now the second largest economy in the world. Is that one of the reasons why they're able to jump up the green rankings?
Well, I think whether they've got pots of cash, I think one of the benefits they do have is that they, again, a country which, a fifth of the population live in, Wales population, over 1 billion people. They have a lot of state control and also state sort of impact in terms of investment. So that they can guarantee change or they can affect change over much longer periods of time than can be done in other parts of the world. So that's a significant difference, I think, when you compare, in Europe, for instance, we've already heard reference to some of the issues about getting investment. It can be very different.
Are they making changes because they have to, or because they want to be more green?
Well, because their economic growth has been, over the last decade or more, has been phenomenal, then that means also the impact in terms of energy use, and then also how they use energy, both in terms of its impact on the environment. They are aware of that. And in China, they're very concerned about. They've used a lot of coal historically to generate electrical power. They have a lot of pollution in the cities. They are very aware of that, and they have the potential to take a lead in some areas of reducing emissions, and they can make a big difference.
And Mark, where do you stand on that? Do you think China should be taking the lead when it comes to emissions?
I think the interesting thing is that China is actually throwing everything they have at energy. And so we look at it and say, oh, aren't they being wonderfully green? No, they have such a huge energy demand that actually they're throwing everything they can, whether it's planting more wind turbines than any other country in the world, whether it is now that they're a net importer of coal since 2010. So they're buying American and Australian coal because their coal mines cannot dig up enough coal to actually fuel their economic revolution. And so I think it's interesting that they are having to deal with this huge economic drive that they've got to fuel somehow, at the same time trying to deal with their local economic and pollution problems. But don't underestimate the Chinese. They're very aware of climate change, and they're very aware that they are very vulnerable on three fronts. And
only perhaps because they are still developing, they're able to be greener during the building process.
Yeah, I think there is a missed opportunity when we assume that only wealthy nations can be green. Even just going back to the Environmental Performance Index, which looks across a range of environmental factors, Costa Rica is very high on that list. Colombia is high on that list because they've taken policy measures to be greener. Latvia is actually the country that is trending the best in terms of transforming its economy. So we're picking countries around the world here that are in various stages of development. Ethiopia just went through a national plan where they looked at economy-wide at their growth targets, maintained the same growth targets, and then discovered that they could either have a business-as-usual case to meet that growth target, which would dramatically increase the amount of CO2 that they put in the atmosphere as they developed. But they could have the same growth targets to become a middle-income country in the next couple of decades, and take a different trajectory that was dramatically less CO2 polluting and much greener with the same growth targets. So, and there are other countries that have tried to put in place these green growth action plans. Mozambique is another very poor country that's trying to figure out how to do this. Rwanda, that's just in Africa. Indonesia in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Peru, Colombia.
Let's spread this out and bring in Benny again and talk more about what fully developed nations should do. This is quite a vulgar analogy, but I kind of like it. We've all been weeing in the swimming pool, but some of us have been doing it ever since we got in, those developed nations. We talked about the industrial revolutions. Should those nations be taking the lead when we talk about becoming greener?
Well, that's what the original Kyoto Protocol established. The industrialized world took on the responsibility, the historical responsibility for the CO2 emissions, and acknowledged that they would have to lead. Not only to lead, but they promised the developing world to finance their transition to a greener energy sector to the tune of $100 billion per year. And now that most Western countries are basically bankrupt, they are rolling back this promise. And the countries like China and India are saying, look, you want us to sign to this agreement? You want us to go green? You promised us $100 billion a year. Where's the money? This is nowadays what is debating at these summits.
No. So we've gone back on promises then. Is that right, Gareth?
Well, I think there's a temptation. I mean, again, I think it was mentioned, the word jitter, through the comparison with China, they once policy is implemented, it's very much clear that policy is going to be there for the long term. In the European countries and also in the US, policy can change quite quickly. And then that undermines investment. And we've just seen that in the UK, where just to pull the plug on one of the largest offshore wind farms. So, that's a real challenge, is getting that confidence for the long-term investment in sort of European countries compared to, say, China.
But there's so much more that I want to talk about. This has been foreshortened somewhat because of the live cross that we had to Parker in the Antarctic. And this won't always be the case, but I'll let you have the last word again, Mark, when we're talking about what should be happening with regards to nations becoming greener.
I think the key thing is to actually communicate and actually get economists to communicate to countries like Ethiopia, who are doing really fantastically well, that you can actually have green growth which reduces local pollution, that actually produces the actual outcome you want. And it doesn't have to be just fossil fuels.
Thank you very much. It's great to see you guys. But that's it for today, I'm afraid. Tomorrow we'll check in with Parker once again and his team as they take their first steps towards the Trans-Antarctic mountain range. And we'll get into the nitty-gritty of whether climate change really is happening now. I bet you'd like to be here for that one, Benny, but I don't think you're going to be part of the panel. We'll see you again soon, though. Thanks very much indeed. Also, remember to look out for updates direct from Parker at willisresilience.com. We'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you, Benny. Thank you. That was brilliant. Thank you, James. Mark, brilliant. Thank you. Sorry that was so quick.